Glass cracked like ice beneath his boots as Jack slid to his knees beside the wreck. The Mercedes had punched the oak so hard the trunk shuddered. Heat breathed from the crumpled hood, smoke slicking the air with bitterness. "Somebody help. She's not breathing," he heard himself shout, the words tearing out of him before thought could catch up. Behind him, his boy hovered at the rusted door of their pickup, small fingers gripping the frame as if it could anchor the world back into sense. Up close, she looked impossibly breakable, lashes clumped with soot, temples streaked with a shallow cut, blouse torn at the buttons where the seatbelt had bruised her sternum. Jack steadied his hands. Marines taught him to count under fire, to keep a rhythm even when everything around him broke apart. 2 fingers to the carotid. There, faint, a bird's wing trapped in a fist. "Hang in there," he murmured, drawing air through his own teeth to keep from tasting the smoke. He braced, laced one hand over the other, and pressed down. 1, 2, 3, compressions measured like steps across a narrow ledge. "Dad," the boy's voice cracked. "The car's gonna blow." Fear pitched it high, the way thunder makes a dog whine. Jack flicked a look at the wobbling plume. Gasoline hissed where it bled into gravel, but the math still favored the woman. "Not yet," he said, as much to his son as to the fire. "Not while she's got a pulse." He kept the tempo, fought the urge to check again, to make sure that tiny flutter hadn't given up. Burnt plastic stung his eyes, sweat pricked beneath the grit on his forearms. "Come on," he breathed, as if coaxing a skittish colt. "Come back." Her lips twitched, the smallest tremor, and a cough stuttered through her chest. It wasn't strong, not yet, but it broke the spell. The line between life and the other thing swung the right direction. Her eyes fluttered, dazed, unfocused, pupils trying to climb back to daylight. Jack slid an arm beneath her shoulders and levered her free of the twisted seat, mind already mapping a clean path to the truck. The passenger side door groaned when he shouldered it open. "You're safe," he said, because words carry weight when the ground is unstable. He lifted her, lighter than he expected, and the boy scrambled back, making room, jaw tight with the kind of courage children practice when they want to look like their fathers. He laid her across the bench seat, propping her so her airway stayed open, then slammed the door and rounded to the driver's side. The truck coughed, then caught. Gravel spat from the tires. Jack checked the rear view. The wreck hunched under its smoke like a wounded animal. He kept his eyes on the road, one hand on the wheel, the other steadying her shoulder when the truck hit ruts that popped the shocks. Sirens found them, thin at first, then growing. Someone else had already called. Good. He pushed the speed anyway. Halfway to the hospital, her breath hitched again and he looked over. Focus gathered behind her eyes like weather. "Why?" she whispered, voice dry and scraped. "Why are you helping me?" The question seemed to cost her. Each word was a climb. Jack frowned, puzzled by the premise. "Because you needed it," he said simply. No sermon, no hero's creed. Just the answer that fit the facts. She blinked, as if that settled something inside her, and let her eyes close. He checked the rise of her chest, still moving. "Keep going." They hit the turnoff. Asphalt smoothed beneath the tires and the sirens drew nearer, folding around them like rails on a bridge. The boy sat rigid, backpack pressed to his chest, stealing glances at the woman and then at Jack, as if cross-checking the way adults do when they're not sure which instrument to trust. "You okay?" Jack asked, not looking away from the lane markers. A small nod. Jack reached over and squeezed his boy's shoulder, then honked once as they swung under the emergency bay awning. Automatic doors split open on a wash of white light. Jack parked crooked, killed the engine, and swept her into his arms again. The shape of her seemed to settle easier now, as if her body had remembered its job. A nurse shouted for a gurney. Hands and scrubs surrounded them, pressing, checking, moving with the choreographed efficiency of people who have seen this moment 100 times and still treat the 101st like it matters. Jack gave the facts as he had them. Crash, unconscious, pulse, compressions, breathing now, and watched her disappear into the corridor. The boy's hand found his. He squeezed back. Only when the doors hissed shut did the noise in Jack's head drop to something like quiet. His arms hummed with leftover adrenaline. His throat tasted of smoke and copper. He glanced at his son, at the sooty fingerprints on the kid's cheek where he'd wiped tears without even noticing. "You did good," Jack said gently. You stayed steady. The boy nodded, as if filing the praise into a pocket he could reach later. Jack looked once more at the doors, then down at his hands, scraped knuckles, blackened nails, and felt an odd, steadying gratitude for training that stuck, for a heartbeat that answered, for the fact that sometimes a straight line from need to action is enough. Whatever came next, questions, forms, the long wait, could come. For now, the only measure that mattered was that she was breathing when she hadn't been, and that his boy had watched a hard thing and learned that you don't turn away. Fluorescent light flattened every shadow in the hallway, turning the world into hard edges and pale faces. Jack stood with his back to the wall, shirt stiff with dried sweat and soot. His son's small hand was locked in his own, knuckles white. They'd been waiting long enough for the adrenaline to leak away, leaving a heavy ache in his shoulders and a silence that felt too large for the narrow space. Every time a door swung open, he straightened a little, hoping, bracing. At last, a doctor appeared, mask lowered, expression even but softened at the corners. "She's stable," he said, voice clipped with relief. Jack let out a breath he hadn't noticed holding. Stable meant breathing, meant heartbeat, meant the work on the roadside had bought her more than just borrowed minutes. The boy leaned into him, whispering, "You saved her, Dad." Jack squeezed his hand gently, but said nothing. Praise wasn't the point. Survival was. "You can see her in a moment," the doctor added. "She'll want to thank you." Jack nodded once, awkward, and followed the nurse down the corridor. The room wasn't what he expected. He thought he'd find family crowding the bed, children, maybe a husband, people with eyes swollen from crying. Instead, the space bristled with dark suits and squared shoulders. Men in earpieces stood rigid, hands near jackets that looked heavy enough to conceal weapons. Their eyes fixed on Jack like a spotlight the second he entered, suspicion sharp enough to slice. He stopped at the threshold, his son shrinking half a step behind him. "Security," one of them barked, already moving as if to block the way. Jack's jaw tightened. He'd been treated like a trespasser before, but this was different. He was still carrying the residue of her blood on his arms. He opened his mouth, ready to explain, when a rasp of sound cut through. "Wait." Her voice, thin, sanded raw, but commanding enough to stall the man mid-step. On the bed, propped against a stack of pillows, she looked small beneath the blankets, though her eyes held something steadier now. Her gaze found Jack and fastened there. "That's him. That's the man who saved me." The suits hesitated, glancing between her and Jack, then grudgingly stepped aside. Jack moved closer, slow, careful, the way you do around animals not yet sure you mean no harm. He stopped near the foot of the bed. She studied him with a kind of measured curiosity, as if trying to reconcile the rough lines of his torn shirt and dirt-streaked hands with the fact that she was alive. "Do you know who I am?" she asked finally. Jack shrugged, plain and unbothered. "Not really." Her lips curved faintly, almost amused despite the oxygen line at her nose. "Victoria Hale, CEO of Hale Enterprises." The way she said it carried weight, something people usually reacted to with awe or at least recognition. Jack only nodded once. "Good to know you'll make it." His tone was steady, simple, and he turned slightly, guiding his son toward the door. For a moment, silence stretched behind them, the kind of silence filled with people and used to being dismissed. But Jack didn't look back. He'd done what he came to do, kept her breathing, delivered her into capable hands. Whatever her name meant to the rest of the world, to him, she was just a stranger who needed help. That was enough. The days that followed settled back into their old rhythm, as though the fire and metal and hospital lights had been a dream too jagged to hold. Jack woke before dawn, same as always, boots crunching frost as he crossed the yard. His son trailed behind, jacket zipped to his chin, carrying the smaller feed bucket with both hands. Chickens clucked irritably at the cold, and the cattle lowed from the far pasture. Life didn't pause for miracles or accidents. Animals still needed hay, fences still sagged, and debts didn't disappear with smoke. Jack fixed the busted latch on the east gate, knuckles raw from the wrench. The boy asked careful questions, the way children do when they're trying to make sense of something too big. "Dad, do you think she's okay now?" Jack tightened the bolt, exhaled through his nose. "The doctors said she was stable. That means she's going to be all right." The boy nodded, satisfied for the moment. But Jack caught the way his eyes lingered, like he carried the image of her pale face in the wreck, same as Jack did. Inside the house, the air smelled of wood smoke and old coffee. Paint flaked from the doorframe. Bills crowded the corner of the table. Jack sat for a minute, rubbing his temples, listening to the quiet tick of the stove. He thought of her only in fragments. The faint pulse under his fingers, the strange calm in her eyes when she whispered, "Why are you helping me?" But each memory came with the same pull in his chest. Then he'd push it away. He had no space for strangers in his fight to keep the ranch. For Victoria, though, the moment refused to fade. In a high-rise office far from dust and barbed wire, she lay awake longer than she liked, the image of his face replaying against the dark. She had been surrounded by men who carried weapons, contracts worth billions, and walls of glass. But in the moment of her greatest vulnerability, it was none of them. It was him. A man with blood on his arms that wasn't his, a little boy waiting by a pickup, and no thought of anything except saving her. Her assistant delivered the report days later, clipped and efficient. Jack Miller, 36, widowed, former Marine, owns a small ranch, raising one son, struggling with debts from his wife's medical bills. She read the words twice, chest tightening. He had risked everything for her without knowing her name, while quietly shouldering battles no magazine cover would ever mention. Gratitude wasn't the right word. It felt too shallow for what she owed. Out on the ranch, Jack poured coffee into a chipped mug, watching his boy kick at frozen dirt with the toe of his boot. The world hadn't changed just because he'd pulled someone from fire. That was fine by him. But miles away, in boardrooms where decisions turned into headlines, Victoria Hale was already sketching out the first steps of a plan. She would find a way to repay what could never truly be repaid. The morning sun hadn't yet burned the mist off the pasture when the low rumble of an unfamiliar engine reached Jack's porch. He was oiling the hinges on the screen door, his boy crouched nearby tracing circles in the dust with a stick. Both looked up as the black SUV rolled slowly up the gravel drive, tires crunching against the stones in a way that didn't belong. The vehicle gleamed, too smooth, too new, against the weathered barn and patched fences. Jack's arms folded across his chest as the door opened. She stepped out. Victoria Hale, though he still thought of her as the woman he'd dragged from fire. Tailored elegance set her apart from everything around her. Dark coat falling just so, heels sinking slightly into the dirt, hair pulled back neat despite the rural wind. She looked like she'd been drawn from another world and dropped, almost absurdly, onto his ranch. "You didn't have to come," Jack said, voice steady but edged, the words more warning than welcome. Her eyes met his, unflinching. "I did," she replied softly, "because I didn't thank you properly." She looked down for a moment, then back up at him. "I owe you my life." Jack's jaw tightened. "You're alive. That's thanks enough." He shifted his weight, already half turned toward the porch as if to end it there. His son, curious, pressed against the doorframe and studied her with wide eyes. Victoria's gaze swept the yard, the peeling paint on the house, the fence posts leaning tiredly, the boy's patched jeans. Compassion flickered in her expression, not pity exactly, but an awareness that her world and his weren't just different, they barely touched. "Jack," she said, her tone firmer now, "you saved me. I can't just walk away knowing what I know now." He shook his head, voice low. "I don't want charity." Her answer came quickly, without hesitation. "This isn't charity. It's gratitude." She stepped closer, her heels catching slightly in the gravel, and her eyes never left his. "And maybe it's justice, too." Something in the way she said it made him pause. He studied her, the strength beneath the polish, the exhaustion she tried to hide. His boy leaned against his side, watching like he was trying to decode every word. Jack finally asked, cautious, "What do you mean by that?" Her lips pressed together, as if weighing how much to reveal on a quiet ranch driveway miles from boardrooms and contracts. The air hung heavy for a beat, chickens clucking somewhere behind the barn. Then, with a steadiness that surprised even herself, she began to explain, not all of it yet, but enough to let him see that her visit wasn't about writing a check. It was about truth, and about what had really put her in that wrecked Mercedes. For a moment, the ranch seemed to hold its breath, the chickens quiet, even the wind slipping away. Victoria stood straighter, the polish of her world colliding with the raw honesty of his. The crash, she began, her voice low but firm. It wasn't an accident. Jack's eyes narrowed, arms still crossed. He didn't flinch, didn't look surprised, just waited. Years in the Marines had trained him to let silence draw the truth out of people. She glanced toward the boy, then back to Jack, deciding he deserved the whole of it. My brakes were tampered with. Someone wanted me out of the way. A rival company's been trying to push me off a deal worth billions. Her gaze held his steadily, though her fingers flexed once at her sides. The crash was supposed to scare me. Maybe worse. Jack's jaw worked, but his voice came even. And you're still going back into that fight? Yes. There was no hesitation. Because if I walk away, they win. And I've built my life refusing to let fear dictate the terms. She exhaled, shoulders softening, then added quietly. But I also know I only survived because fate, or maybe something greater, put you on that road. Jack looked past her at the SUV, at the men inside waiting, scanning the fields. He thought of the faint flutter of her pulse beneath his fingertips, the weight of her in his arms, his boy's voice breaking behind him. He thought of battles he'd fought overseas, where enemies had faces he could see and lines he could draw. This was murkier, corporate warfare spilling into sabotage. I don't fight alone anymore, she said, and for the first time her voice wavered. Not after you. The boy tugged at Jack's sleeve, whispering just loud enough. Dad, they tried to hurt her? Jack glanced down, saw the fear and the curiosity tangled together in his son's eyes. He rested a hand on the boy's shoulder, steadying. His gaze returned to Victoria. Then you'd better be ready, he said quietly. Because men who cross lines like that don't stop at one try. His tone wasn't pity, wasn't admiration. It was the blunt assessment of a man who'd seen how far some enemies would go. Victoria's chin lifted. I am ready. I just needed you to know. Not because I expect anything, but because you deserve the truth. For a long moment, nothing moved but the dust lifting in the sun. Then Jack gave a single nod, the kind that carried more weight than words. She had her fight, and he had his life, but now both knew their paths had tangled for a reason neither could yet name. The call came just after dusk, when Jack was stacking hay in the barn and his boy was finishing homework at the kitchen table. The phone buzzed once, twice, then again, an unfamiliar number, but he answered anyway. On the other end, Victoria's voice trembled beneath its usual steel. They came after my family, she said. No preamble, no explanation, just fear stripped bare. Jack, I don't know who else to trust. Jack froze, pitchfork leaning against his shoulder. He could hear noise in the background, raised voices, doors slamming, the sharp edge of panic that told him this wasn't business competition anymore. Where? He asked, already moving toward the house. My estate. Men were on the grounds tonight. Security chased them off, but she drew a ragged breath. They'll be back. Jack's son looked up as his father came through the door, already pulling on his jacket. The boy's pencil rolled forgotten across the table. Dad. Jack crouched, meeting his son's eyes, steadying his voice even as his pulse kicked harder. I've got to help her. You stay here. Lock the doors. I'll be back before morning. The boy swallowed and nodded, the trust in his small face cutting deeper than fear. Minutes later, Jack's truck roared down the highway. One hand on the wheel, the other flipping through contacts on an old phone he kept for moments like this. Need you, he said when each familiar voice answered. Not overseas. Here. Tonight. Marines answered with the same clipped certainty they had years ago. No questions. Just locations, times, affirmatives. By the time he reached the gates of Victoria's estate, headlights were already lined along the drive. Old friends climbed out of pickup trucks and SUVs. Men whose eyes carried the same weight of memory as Jack's. They didn't need orders. The bond of service was enough. Victoria stood on the porch, flanked by her own security detail, but relief washed over her face when she saw him. You came, she whispered, though she sounded more like someone who'd finally exhaled after holding her breath too long. Jack nodded once, scanning the grounds. We'll hold the line. His voice was quiet, but it carried the authority of a man who'd been here before, in darker places with higher stakes. All through the night, they stood guard. Jack at the gates, others stationed along the perimeter, eyes adjusting to the dark, ears tuned to every rustle. When a car slowed on the distant road, Jack stepped forward, stance steady until the threat passed. When shadows moved in the tree line, One of his men shifted, rifle slung but ready. By dawn, the air felt lighter, the tension loosening with the rising sun. The men drifted back to their trucks, trading nods that meant more than words. No shots fired, no direct confrontation, but the message had been delivered. She was no longer alone, no longer an easy target. Victoria came down the steps, robe wrapped tightly around her. Exhaustion in her face, but gratitude stronger still. She looked at Jack as though she saw him differently now, not just the man who had pulled her from wreckage, but the one who had chosen to stand guard at her gates when others might have walked away. He said nothing of it, only met her gaze and offered the smallest nod. The fight wasn't over, but she knew now. Her wealth might buy protection, but Jack's loyalty, unpaid, unasked, was rarer than anything she'd ever owned. Months later, the chandeliered ballroom shimmered with gold light, every table draped in linen, every chair filled with the kind of people whose names appeared in financial papers more often than phone books. Jack stood near the back, tugging at the collar of a suit borrowed from an old friend, the fabric too stiff against his shoulders. His boy, scrubbed clean and proud in a small jacket, clutched his hand and gawked at the towers of flowers and trays of glittering glass. Neither belonged here, and Jack felt it down to his boots. But they were here because Victoria had asked. At the center of the room, cameras flashed as Victoria Hale took the stage. She wore midnight silk, her posture regal, her voice carrying clear over the low murmur of the crowd. "Some of you know me as a businesswoman," she began. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the hall. "But tonight, I want to tell you about a man who changed my life." The hall stilled. Jack shifted his weight, uneasy under the sudden attention her words threatened to draw. His son's hand tightened in his, and he leaned down just enough to murmur, "It's okay. Just listen." Victoria's gaze swept the room, but Jack felt when it landed on him, steady and sure. "Months ago, I was pulled from a burning car. I should not have survived. But I did, because one man refused to turn away. He risked his life while his own son watched from the road, learning in real time what courage looks like." Her voice caught for a heartbeat, but she pressed on. "That man is Jack Miller." Heads turned, 100 eyes seeking him. Jack's ears burned, but he held still, shoulders squared, son pressed close at his side. Victoria's tone deepened, carrying more than polished speech. It carried truth. "Jack reminded me that the greatest wealth isn't found in contracts or accounts. It is found in the courage and kindness of ordinary people who choose to act when no one else will." For a moment, silence hovered, the kind that settles right before thunder. Then the room rose, first in ripples, then all at once. Applause thundered against the chandeliers, echoing in the marrow of the hall. Cameras snapped, flashes burning white across polished walls. Jack's son looked up at him, eyes shining, a smile breaking through that made the whole suit ordeal worth it. "That's my dad," he whispered, half to himself, half to the universe. Jack swallowed hard, the sound almost lost beneath the roar of clapping. He hadn't asked for this stage, this spotlight, this declaration. But in that moment, seeing his boy's pride, he understood something simple. You never know whose life you're saving, or how they might end up saving yours. Victoria closed her speech with a steady voice, eyes still anchored to him. "I am alive, not just surviving but better, because of him. Tonight I stand here because Jack Miller chose to act." The applause rose again, wave after wave. Jack stood rooted, not because he craved the praise, but because his son's small voice was still echoing in his chest. "That's my dad." And in that truth, the world felt steadier than it had in years.